Hi, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle, back doing our pandemic projects. I'm trying to do one of these a day just to keep everybody's mind off of the craziness going on with the viruses. Going into my old bag of tricks and boxes and the like, just to pick out some things that are popular reels that maybe haven't been worked on in a while. And I selected today the Penn 155 Beachmaster. Now this reel has been around an awful long time. I think it was probably made starting in the early 50s, and production continued, I think into the 1990s or 2000s. There's been some various changes on it. This one is a newer model. If you have an older model, you probably have an etched side plate, or maybe one with the words Penn on it, or maybe ones with some cross hatching in there. The side plates have changed over time. This one has an aluminum spool, an anodized spool. The originals came with either a plastic spool or a chrome spool. The plastic spool was not intended to be a cheaper version. What it was intended to be is a lighter weight version for casting, and the chrome spool more appropriate for drop fishing. And of course this one right in the middle here is an aluminum spool. Turns very nice and freely. That means this reel, which has a low profile and a pretty good capacity, could be used for surf casting. And interestingly enough, it was one of the first reels that I bought my daughter, one of my daughters, in the early 80s to go ocean fishing with, because it's a pretty versatile reel, drop fishing, pier fishing, surf casting, among other things. So if you have the 155, I'm going to take this apart, show you how to tune it up. My notion is that the drag washers in this one need to be replaced. That's why I'm going to go in and service this. But we'll show you how to take this apart, service it, and put it back together and take it fishing again. So we're going to start by removing the set screw that holds the handle screw in place. This one you also can tell the age on because it has a rubber handle. The rubber handles came after the Bakelite handles, the old bullet plastic handles. So when you're out there shopping around, unless you find that maybe somebody has replaced the handle, that's an indicator that it's a newer versus an older reel. Another indication when we get inside is the type of anti-reverse spring that they used. If it's got a coil spring, it was made after 1957. If it has a flat spring, it was made prior to that. We'll show you how to reassemble this based on the type of spring that it has, but I did do a video showing how to do both types of anti-reverse dog springs during reassembly. Okay, we took the gear sleeve off, we took the star adjuster off, we took the handle off. Now we can take the side plate off. You'll notice a couple of things. I have a protective glove on my hand. These things are getting harder and harder to find during the pandemic. But I like to use these to keep that junk off my hand. I also have a parts tray, and in that parts tray I put all the pieces that I take off into that so that I know where to find it on reassembly. Now this frame and reel is clean, it's spinning. I don't expect any major issues here, but again, we'll do this just to check on those drags and see if they need replacing. I think that's why this reel is in my to-do bucket. It's not a customer's reel, it's just one of these that I acquired from a flea market or a lot sale over time. So this opportunity here to kind of stay at home and do some things just helps give me the ability to go do some things I wouldn't normally do, like clean out some boxes and things in my shop. And quite honestly, it's kind of been fun in that regard. Not that I want to get to it, but I did. For example, here's a bag. It's just got all kinds of things in there. I don't know what reel or reels these things belong to. I can only tell you that I got an assortment in here of screws and springs and drags and the like. I think it's just a whole bunch of things that may have been on the bottom of something at one point in time, and I just put them in the bag so we didn't lose them. But one of these days, if I really get down to it, I'll go and try and identify some of these things and make more sense out of them. I can see there's a couple of screws here for Mitchell bales. There's an anti-reverse dog spring here, belongs on some spinning wheel and so on. But at any rate, that's what we're doing to pass our time here. Two different size screws on the side plate. That's why I left them out here on the table. That short screw goes into the reel seat, which is the bottom here. The longer screws go into the crossbars. Make a note of that when you go to reinstall, just so that you have it right when you do the reassembly. This reel can use a cleaning, which is good because that's one of the reasons why we've been doing this series, is to show you how to service that. Otherwise, it looks to be operational. We saw before that it seemed to be fine. And as I mentioned, I think that the drag washers need to be replaced in this one. And what I do, if I am doing a reel that I own, that I intend to sell at some point, I do like to take the reel apart and service it completely. That way I know what the reel is all about. I know that if there's any broken parts, that I've replaced them, if there's any worn drags, that they've been addressed, so that I can feel comfortable that the person that's going to purchase that reel and take it fishing doesn't have something that is going to break down on them first cast. Okay, we've pulled all the screws. I'm going to push that through. I'm going to hold my hand behind it now to trap that one spring that's the anti-reverse dog spring. I've mentioned in the past, maybe I can do it on this one. One of our viewers told us, let's go put the thing, instead of cupping your hand, put the spring assembly into a little plastic bag like this, push it through, and that way when the spring does shoot, if it does shoot, you'll trap it and be able to locate it. So there you go. That's a way of doing it. And interestingly enough, this reel was made before 1957, so I would think that's what's happened here. Is this could have been a number of things. The frame may be the same. It's possible that somebody upgraded the spool, because this spool certainly wasn't a 1957 circa spool. But we have that flat spring for the anti-reverse dog. It's right here. This is the spring that I was talking about shooting. That flat spring is here, and that flat spring, I know from just researching the reel, that flat spring was changed over to a coil spring and anti-reverse dog in 1957. Sometimes you just get stuck on trivia. That's one of the little trivia things about this particular reel. So there's your anti-reverse dog. I've just cleaned it off. And so my guess is somewhere along the line, and it would make sense. I mean, the reel is 60 years plus old, so it would make sense that somebody upgraded the spool during that period. And my guess is they updated it probably in the 1980s or 90s, because that's when those anodized aluminum spools started to come out. We're going to complete the disassembly of this reel. We push in on the pinion gear. That's going to depress the yoke and springs. Going to make sure that the jack knob here, the stud, is all the way up, so we can remove the jack. And then we're going to release the yoke spool gear. I'm going to take those springs out and put those into the tray before we get too much further along, because we don't want to lose those. I'm just going to check right now. At some point I always check, but I'm going to check to make sure that the teeth on the pinion gear are good. And another thing that happens with these wings, or the slot here, sometimes start to fold out and cause a problem. So I'm just going to check to make sure that they're not bent, which they aren't. Sometimes they get bent if the reel gets hung up in the rocks, and folks put undue stress on the gearing trying to pull it out. Sometimes it tends to fan it out that way. And right now the grease is just dried grease, so I'm removing it with a paper towel, just like the gloves becoming hard to find in these pandemics, but I'm using a paper towel. And if it was more stubborn grease, I would use steel wool to do that, or I would use a degreaser like a penetrating oil or the like to free up that lube. So that goes in, keeping that main assembly on the side for a moment. And there's accumulated grease and junk in the channels here. So I'm going to use the cotton swabs to get that buildup out of there. There's no sense putting good grease in over bad grease, so get the old grease out of there first. And then I'm just going to set this aside. We'll do all the lubing in a moment. If there was junk, corrosion, greening, things like that going on here, then I would remove the post completely. I would clean these with a steel wall, maybe use some metal polish like this automotive polish or chrome polish to clean up the thing. But this reel is clean. So somebody replaced the reel seat, replaced the spool, did the cleaning at that time, and not quite sure why this wound up in the lot sale, but we got it, and that's all good. And again, I would rather sell a reel that I've worked on and opened up and made sure is right, even if it seemed to be performing okay on the front end of that. So I'll lay that on the side, and now we're going to come over to the bridge assembly. This should just pull off, which of course it just did, which was nice. Sometimes that's a struggle. And we're going to remove the gear sleeve here. To do that, you want to take a pin or a punch. In this case, this is the bottom of an electrical tester, and push the pin. Hopefully we can see it. The pin that holds the sleeve onto the main portion. And sometimes you need a little assist from a pair of pliers or something. This pin will pull all the way out. Just be careful if you do. I like to, if it does come out like that, I like to just put it right back in as a start before I put that into my parts tray. And we can clean that main shaft and the grease and the junk underneath that after we remove the gear sleeve. So we're doing that right now. And there seems to be a little bit of buildup, so I'm going to go in with that that steel wall, just trying to get the last of it off. You can see how it's cleaned up some of the tarnish. Now on the outside there's no mechanical rhyme or reason or function to that, but on the inside here, where that gear sleeve is going to ride and where the anti-reverse dog is going to ride, then it makes sense to give that a little bit of a rub there. Same thing with the shaft here. You want to take a paper towel and wipe off the old grease. This is the channel that pin rides in. It holds the gear sleeve on. Just take that paper towel, use your thumbnail or something else, make sure that groove is clean, and then we can start all of this re-greasing. I'm going to use Penn's precision reel grease here. I tell folks it doesn't have to be Penn for Penn reels. It doesn't have to be Shimano for Shimano reels or anything else. It needs to be real grease. Okay, we're going to take that. We're going to grab that gear sleeve again. We're going to put that over and push that pin in. Now I got to tell you, it's not always easy like that with that pin. Sometimes it's very difficult. Just take your time as you're doing that. When you do that, check the grooves here of the gear sleeve. That's where your adjuster, your star adjuster, is going to ride. So if you have any questions about whether that's clogged with old grease, just take something like a wire brush here and clear those channels so that operates smoothly. Next up then, we've got the drag washer assembly. This is where I was thinking I was going to have to go in and replace the drags. There's a hard washer here. That hard washer sits on the gear sleeve. And somewhat to my surprise, we've already had the drag washers replaced in this. They're HT100s. It's exactly what I was going to use if I was to replace them. So I don't need to replace, I just need to clean and lube. But if you were to replace, you'd take the same thing. You'd take the old leather washers out. You would check all of the grooves on the main gear to make sure that the teeth are nice and straight and uniform and not chipped or cracked. Grab your grease. Take a little bit of grease and spot it along the way of the main gear. You don't have to get it in all the slots. As the reel spins, it will distribute the grease. And place that down over the middle. Okay, we have a series of 3 fabric washers and 3 metal washers. So let's make sure that those are cleaned off. These have oil on them. There's a question of whether you oil or grease drags. In this case, the drags should have grease on them. If anything, they're the HT100s. They're the modern version of the old leather ones. And the sequence to these, we have an oval washer, and we have a fabric washer, then we have what's called the eared washer, and then another fabric washer, and actually it goes this way, and then we have a cap washer. So I use Cal's Universal Drag Grease for the drag washers that require them. I'm going to just dip that into some of that grease. I'm going to rub it in with my gloved hand, wipe off the excess with a paper towel, and then put the first of the shouldered washers in. These have 2 flat sides. Flat sides line up with the flat sides on your gear sleeve, and that helps hold that gear sleeve during the compression process. The second one has ears, but it's round, so the second one's going to rotate around that gear sleeve, but it's going to hold the main gear in place. There's 2 little slots inside the main gear. You can see how it's properly set here. You have to have those slots in that main gear. If you don't, it won't work properly, and you'll bend that gear up, and then you won't have any drag. Last of the fabric washers then. This is another one that's got the flat-sided to it. And then we have the cap washer, which goes up top. Okay, so we've done the lubrication. We've checked the main drags. They didn't need to be replaced. I can feel good if I go to resell this and the fella asks me about the drags, fella or gal asks me about the drags, I can say that they are the HT100s and that they are in good condition. I'm going to put a little bit of grease onto the bearing in the side plate, put a little bit of grease onto the click mechanism as well, just to keep that functional. Okay, then we can put the spool in. You want to just check the back of the spool. If there's any accumulated grease or that on the click mechanism or the spool shaft, now's your time to get rid of that. As I go to reinstall the spool, I want to do the same thing. Use that paper towel or the steel wool to clean that up, and put a little bit of light greasing on that, because when we put the spool gear in, we're not inside the spool gear, and you want to make sure that's lubricated. Alright, we'll come over to this side then. We want to put the grease into that back bearing there, put a little bit of grease onto the eccentric, which is going to move the jack up and down. We'll come over and we're going to take the yoke, because it looks like a yoke on an oxen or otherwise. I'll put some grease onto that so that the spool gear rides easily in that thread. We've already checked the teeth on the spool gear, and we know from the pre-test that the wheel is functioning nicely. So we're just going to get some grease onto the teeth there. And then we're going to grab those 2 springs that go in the inserts. So here's spring 1, here's the other. Now we can take the yoke assembly with the slot on the spring, on the spool gear or the pinion gear facing outward. And we're going to press down. This is the opposite of the way that we took it off. Press it down and then rotate the jack over that pivot point. So this is the top end of the assembly. We'll now take the bridge assembly, which was completed. We're going to press down again. We're going to insert, and we're going to rotate this bridge shaft halfway. We're going to let that bridge rest on top of the pinion gear so that you have access to setting the dog. Now this one we mentioned was a flat spring. What we didn't mention is there's 2 types of screws that came out of that bridge assembly. One has got a partial thread and one has got a fully thread. The partial threads are going to go up top where these springs are, and that's going to enable the spring to ride up and down on the shaft without catching. The bottom one, including the one for this anti-reverse dog, is the fully threaded spring. Grab that. We're going to take the dog and we're going to insert it on the top, making sure that it is over the ridge on the gear sleeve. And we've got this little flat spring that sits on top of the dog, and this is kind of hard to do by the camera because I need my eyesight to make sure that I'm getting it in the channel properly, but I'll show you as soon as it's done. It sits on top of the dog, it wraps around this post, and the tail end of it rests inside the side plate. So again, it's laying on top of the dog, behind the post, inside the side plate. And then once you do that, you can complete your rotation of the bridge. Hold it tight because you don't want anything to fly while you're doing that. And just get that screw started there. Don't drive it all the way home because you're going to need some, well, for lack of a better term, some wiggle room as you go to install the other ones. Now I install opposite posts, high and low. I call it north, south, east, west directionally because I want to keep the bridge plate aligned, and in no cases am I driving that home. Next is the fully threaded screw. You notice I put the partially threaded screw up top where that spring is. The fully threaded screw goes below. We come back on the other side with the other partially threaded screw. We put that into the top side, in this case left. And now that I have all of the screws starting to come through the bridge, I can go back and tighten them. And I do it the same way, kind of north, south, east, and west, rotating it so that I keep equal pressure on that bridge. All right, that's the side plate. We'll give it a turn. You can hear that the anti-reverse dog is working, a nice loud click. And the only thing we haven't lubricated on this then is that front side of the jack here where it's going to slide under the bridge. So just take the time to do that right now. And then we can go put the side plate onto the wheel. And you'll notice in this case, it's sitting flush. If the lever was tripped, sometimes it doesn't sit flush. And you can just adjust that by tripping the lever so that you have each side of the plate set properly. Longer screws go into the crossbars. And the shorter screws go into the wheel seat. And I do the same thing here that I just did there. I go opposite sides, so I get the top one started. And then I'll put one in the wheel seat, and then I'll come back and do the other ones. Again, you want to keep the tension right. If there's any binding going on or a chance of binding going on, not just with this reel, but with any reel in particular, this gives you that chance to even out the force and avoid that issue. Okay, so we got them in. They went in pretty easily, but if you were having trouble aligning, use a pick like I used to poke the that pin out of the gear sleeve or otherwise, and just use that to center the and position it. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to grab the other short screw here for the wheel seat. Now if you put the long screw in the wheel seat, what's going to happen is it's going to protrude over here, and there's a chance that as your line is spinning off, it could grab that little knuckle hanging out there. So make sure that you put it in the right position. Put the second one in on this side. Grab the second one on the other side. And the process that we've done here pretty much applies to most of the Penn reels in the 1960s, 70s, and so on. Internally, they all kind of look the same. The parts are a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, but the reels, like the Beachmaster, it's series, so you have the 155, you have the 160, you have the 180, which is direct drive, if I remember correctly. Those all share the same parts. You have the Surfmaster 150 and the Surfmaster 200, which share the same parts. The difference there is you have a one screw side plate take apart system, and there are some others out there that share the same. And then if you get a little bit bigger part, the Penn Long Beach series, the setup is pretty much the same. As I mentioned, there's two different types of anti-reverse springs. We were working on the one today that had the flat spring. There's a coil spring, but again, they're pretty much the same setups across the Long Beach, the Surfmaster, and the Beachmaster lines, that if you learn how to do the one reel, you can do all of those reels with a little bit of exception. You might find that an eccentric spring is on the left side as opposed to the right side, and so on. But note that if you don't have this reel, but if you have one of its sisters, you can do just fine. Put a little bit of oil to just make sure that the little stud that the handle is riding on is okay. Doing it on this side as well. And this reel now has been lubed. The drags have been serviced. It's been taken apart, cleaned, and reassembled. All we have to do now is give it a test, and there you go. So test the drags, make sure that they're nice and tight, they're holding well, and this one's ready to go fishing again. Now, sometimes folks ask me, they said, I reassemble and my reel is tight. And what happens is, because you put new grease into the bearings on both sides, sometimes that tightens it up. Just adjust your bearing just a little bit. You want to have a little bit of free play in that spool. That's a little bit too much, but you want to make sure that it's moving. If it's tightened down too much, it's going to impair the performance of the reel. In this case, that's pretty much done just the way it should be. We have that anti-reverse, you can tell from the spring. So, the takeaway on this is that it's not hard to lubricate and tune these up. It should be done on a periodic basis. It's not hard to replace the drag stack. And if you're mechanically inclined to do so, I hope this video has shared the step-by-step processes and procedures to do that. I do repair reels. Folks ask me from time to time. I do repair reels by mail, so if this seems intimidating or it's something that you don't want to take on and you're interested in having me service your reel, not only this one, but just about